بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on the Mutammima al-Ajrumiyya, we are about to start the section on al-I'rab wal-Bina. So we reached وَالْحَرْفُ مَا لَا يَصْلُحُ مَعَهُ دَلِيلُ الْإِسْمِ وَلَا دَلِيلُ الْفِعْلِ. So the harf is that which neither the signs of the ism nor the fi'l apply to. And this is mentioned in the Ajrumiyya as well. In the Mutammima, he adds kahal wa fi wa lam. Right? So he gives examples for the harf. Right? And these are not mentioned because they're differed upon. They're simply mentioned because, examples were given for the ism and the fi'l, even in the Ajrumiyya. However, examples were not given in the Ajrumiyya for the harf. So the author of the Mutammima, he gave these examples. Then he says, Babul I'rabi wal Bina, the chapter on I'rab and Bina. And you notice right from the subject heading, he's given an addition to what's in the Ajrumiyya by mentioning al-Bina. Right? So the first thing we see is he says رحمه الله تعالى الإعراب تغيير أواخر الكلم لاختلاف العوامل الداخلة عليها لفظا أو تقديرا. إعراب, الإعراب تغيير أواخر الكلم is the changing of the ends of words. Now, al-I'rab, right? Here, of course, this is referential, right? Because I'rab, that the I'rab that's being referred to here is I'rab that relates to the Arabic language. Al-I'rab تغيير أواخر الكلم is the changing of the endings of words. لاختلاف العوامل الداخلة عليها. The lam here is to mentioning the cause of the تغيير because of the changing of the awamil, the agents entering upon those words, لفظا أو تقديرا. Right? Whether this change is lafzi or actual visible change, or تقديرا or implicit, right? هو ما لا يظهر أثره, that whose trace is not explicitly found. The word i'rab, al-Fakihi here tells us usefully that, of course, i'rab is from the af'ala pattern. A'raba yu'ribu i'raban, right? So it's a masdar. And it has multiple meanings in the Arabic language. He says from them is al-ibana, to express. Abana, from the same root as bayyin, is to make something clear, to bring clarity to something. والتحسين, and beautifying something, والتغيير, and change. Right? And here, the most direct meaning, he says, is this last one, is التغيير. Because the words that are mu'rab are those that are given to change in their ending states. But the other meanings are also of consequence. Right? And here, if you look in the Kawakib, he gives examples, right? So the meaning of expression, you say أعرب فلان عما في نفسه. So and so expressed what was within, what he was keeping within, right? And tahseen, you say أعربت الشيء. أعربت الشيء إذا حسنته, if I beautify something. If someone's stomach change, the Arabs would sometimes say أعرب الله المعدة. Allah made my stomach change, right? And there are two opinions about which one of the meanings is most directly suitable, right? So in the Kawakib, he quotes Imam al-Suyuti from a work of his called Ham'ul Hawami', right? But basically, that the meaning of ibana, of making clear, is the most suitable, right? Because what does i'rab do? I'rab makes expressions clear, right? Like you say, ضرب زيد عمرو, who hit whom? Right? If you say ضرب زيد Dawood, is Zayd Dawood the name of somebody? Or is it, because it could be ضرب زيدا داوود, right? So the meaning of ibana is most appropriate. But there's but the three are interrelated in a sense, right? That these changes, this taghyir, results in ibana, the change. So i'rab has three primary meanings: التغيير والإبانة والتحسين. So these changes that happen to the end of words make the meanings of the statements clear, thereby beautifying speech, right? Because clarity and consistency are amongst the characteristics of beauty. Right? Beauty is for things to be in their right order. Right? تغيير أواخر الكلم, right? 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 Kalim, of course, is the plural of kalima, right? Right? And this taghyir could be haqiqatan or hukman, as the commentator makes clear, right? And these are the there are two types of words broadly that are subject to i'rab, right? The first is called al-ism al-mutamakkin, which is also the al-ism al-mu'rab, and number two is al-fi'l al-mudari', right? In its default case, right? Al-fi'l al-mudari', that nothing has affected, right? Because some things affect the fi'l mudari', putting it into bina, right? لاختلاف العوامل الداخلة عليها, because of the different agents that affect it. And the awamil are significant, right? Because what causes the change in i'rab? It's the amil, right? Interestingly, this is not something that the Ajrumiyya touches upon directly, right? But here, it's worth looking at al-Kawakib al-Durriya. Al-Awamil, he gives a good definition, right? Al-Awamil jam'u amil. Awamil is a plural of amil, which means that which does the work. What does the work of i'rab, thereby bringing out the meaning of the sentence, is the amil. It's doing the heavy lifting in this sentence. He says, وهو ما أوجب كون آخر الكلمة على وجه مخصوص من رفع أو نصب أو جر أو جزم. Right? It is that which causes the end of the word to be in a particular state. You can say على ما أوجب كون آخر الكلمة على وجه مخصوص من الإعراب. Good put. الداخلة عليها لفظا أو تقديرا. So, the lafzi is like if you say رأيت زيدا, for example, right? زيدا is مفعول به منصوب, and the تغيير is clear because you can see the alama of the nasb with the fatha and tanween, the alif and tanween is explicit, as opposed to ra'aytul fata, I saw the fata. Fata is also mansub, but the sign of its being in nasb is بفتحة مقدرة على آخره, مقدرة في آخره, because the fatha there is there, but it is implicit. منع من ظهورها ماذا? It could not appear due to, in the case of fatha, التعذر, because you can't have a fatha on an alif, as opposed to مررت بقاضٍ, I passed by a qadi, مررت بقاضٍ. So قاضٍ is مجرور بكسرة مقدرة على آخره, right? Right? Because the tanween there is for, it's called tanweenul iwad. It should be qadi, because qadi is heavy, right? جاء قاضٍ. قاضٍ is مرفوع بضمة مقدرة في آخره منع من ظهورها الثقل, because you could say جاء القاضي, but it's heavy. So it's possible, it's not متعذر, but it's called ثقل, heavy. Okay. So then he says وأقسامه أربعة, right? And the categories of i'rab And he says here, أقسامه أربعة أي أنواعه, the types. Right? رفع ونصب وخفض وجزم. Right? And رفع takes place with either حركة or حذف or حرف. Right? ضمة واو ألف نون, as we will see. And ونصب, the نصب can be with a حركة or a حرف or حذف. Right? Or the subtracting of a letter. And we'll be seeing these. وخفض. And we're just going to stick to using خفض as Ibn al-Ajrum did it in the Ajrumiyya. We won't keep saying that خفض is the same as jar. And خفض is by حركة or حرف وجزم, which is with سكون or حذف. Now, saying that i'rab is these, here there's a discussion. Is i'rab lafzi or ma'nawi? Right? And there's also discussion as to which way did Ibn al-Jurrum go in the discussion of i'rab being lafzi or ma'nawi. So if it's lafzi, then the rafa is the dhamma. Right? So you say جاء زيد زيد فاعل مرفوع بضمة ظاهرة في آخره. Right? So the dhamma is the rafa. If i'rab is ma'nawi, so i'rab isn't the change itself, but it's a state that's expressed by the particular haraka or harf, or in some cases hadf. Then you'd say جاء زيد زيد فاعل مرفوع وعلامة رفعه ضم آخره, or ضمة ظاهرة في آخره. Right? So Al-Fakihi says in his commentary, وَجَعْلُ هَذِهِ الْأَرْبَعَ أَنْوَاعًا لِلْإِعْرَابِ أَنْسَبُ بِمَنْ جَعَلَهُ لَفْظِيًّا. Right? The authors making these parts of i'rab is more suitable in terms of considering i'rab to be lafzi, and that's contested. And they also discuss why this order was chosen. Dhamma, rafa, then nasb, then khafd, then jazm. Right? And they discuss that. Beginning, because an intelligent person's actions should always be principled. Right? That why are you doing it in this way? There's a reason. Right? And sometimes it seems like there's takalluf, but no, it's a logical thing. Right? If the human being is a rational animal, their actions are based on reason. Right? That which is not based on reason should be identifiable. That was just incidental. But if most of what they do is incidental, then they're only incidentally rational, right? He explains that in the commentary, right? And one of the reasons being that rafa is what? The rafa is relates to the umad of a sentence, the pillars of a sentence. So it's the most noble, right? In that sense. So he says, فَلِلْأَسْمَاءِ, right? مِنْ ذَلِكَ, and here again, there is stuff missing from the commentary. Correct? Omar, what do you have? And then من ذلك اللهم اغفر لنا وللمسلمين والمسلمات. Okay, so our copy has mistakes again here. Right? Right? So the matan says فللأسماء من ذلك الرفع والنصب والخفض ولا جزم فيها. Right? What does your copy have? That statement, you have it? In the commentary itself? But in the commentary? The text is there in full in the commentary. Alhamdulillah. Good. Allahumma. Like, so this copy we have, every few pages, there's just parts of the sharh that are just missing. So, فللأسماء من ذلك الرفع والنصب والخفض ولا جزم فيها. Right? And ultimately, the reason is that's how the Arabs spoke. Right? That's how the Arabs spoke. So there's no jazm in the asma. وللأفعال من ذلك الرفع والنصب والجزم ولا خفض فيها. Right? And the af'al have a rafa and nasb and jazm, and there's no khafd in it. So in this sense, what it's good to remember, the asma don't have jazm and the af'al don't have khafd. Right? Those are the two things that are unique to each. And they give different reasonings for it. We don't have to spend much time on them. So this is what is found in the Ajrumiyya itself. Now, the author of the Mutammima, rahimahullah ta'ala, adds to it by saying, وَالْبِنَاءُ لزوم أواخر الكلم حركة أو سكونا. Right? Bina. Right? So this is from the extra in the Mutammima. Right? So some have just said it. لزوم, you need that. البناء لزوم أواخر الكلم حالة واحدة. Right? It's for the ends of bina is. So fixed words are those that always remain in one state. Right? وأنواعه أربعة. Now, some would say, well, unless something happens to them, right? Because something could have a sukoon at the end in bina, but يحرك لغيره. So some put the word asalatan, because for example, min, right? It has a sukoon, but if you put min and then you put al afterwards, in Arabic you cannot have ijtima'us sakinain or iltiqa'us sakinain, two sakins, two sukoons coming in contact. How do you pronounce it? So, the takhallus from that, how you get out from that, the default is that a kasra is used. So you find, for example, minan nas. So right? So that's a bad example, of course, because they're minan nas, right? There, it's like a fatha being present. Manil ladhi, right? Manil ladhi. So there's a kasra that comes, but this is li'arid, because of a secondary consideration. Okay. وأنواعه أربعة ضم, right? وفتح ضم like حيث, وفتح, right, like أين, وكسر like أمسي, وسكون like kam, right? So this is from the zawaid. Then he says walismu darban, and the ism is of two types. Mu'rabun wa huwa al-asl. The basis of the asma is i'rab. وهو ما تغير آخره بسبب العوامل الداخلة عليه. Right? And the mu'rab ism is the one whose endings change because of the awamil. Right? He's already given us the definition of i'rab, but he's just spelling it out. So this is a bit of detail. Technically, it would not necessarily be needed, but just to be very explicit about it. So the ism, this is an important principle to keep in mind. The asl in the ism is i'rab. فَمَا جَاءَ مَبْنِيًا, so that which is mabni, كَانَ خِلَافَ الْأَصْل, is contrary to the asl, and there would be some reason behind it. The primary reason being that it resembles the fi'l or the harf. Right? Right? And this اختلاف العوامل could be إما لفظا كزيد وعمر وإما تقديرا. It could be explicitly like زيد and عمر, يعني جاء زيد رأيت عمرا مررت بخالد, etc. Or تقديرا نحو موسى والفتى. Right? جاء موسى رأيت الفتى مررت بليلى, etc. Right? ومبني. Right? And the second kind is mabni. Right? So the ism والاسم ضربان معرب ومبني. Right? So you could, in your notes, things like that are good to number. Right? الأول معرب والثاني مبني. وهو الفرع. Right? And this is the far'a, this is derivative. Right? And it's far'a because it's خلاف الأصل. Because the asl was that the ism is mu'rab. Right? And they say the wisdom of the ism by default requiring i'rab is because the ism, remember, what's the most important sign of the ism? What's the most important sign of the ism? Al-isnad ilayhi. Right? It's talked about. Right? So the placement of the asma, right? Because it could be the fa'il, it could be the maf'ul. Right? Other things are used to refer to it. And the harf, what does it enter into? Does a harf enter into the fi'l? Bija'a. Not when it only enters into a fi'l when the fi'l is actually an ism. Right? Like you say, anyway, that's a separate thing. Like if you refer, so you say, بدأت بجاء. Right? Right? But it's like there, it's like as if in English you'd say, it's within quotes. I began with جاء, quote unquote, right? So you're referring to the the kalima, the word that is ja'a. So anyways, that's outside the consideration. So the asma, because they're used in all these different contexts, they are more in need, they're more in need of the changes. The af'al are less in need of the changes, which is why the asl in the af'al is bina. Except for the mudari', as we'll see in a moment. Right? Yeah, right? And if you're interested in understanding why some asma are mabni, right? Right? That الفاكهي says ثم لا يبنى إلا إذا أشبه الحرف شبها قويا يدنيه منه. Right? An ism only becomes mabni if it resembles the harf strongly, such that it draws it close to it في الوضع, like in its lexical placement, أو المعنى, or in its meaning, أو الاستعمال. Right? And that's something we'll be looking at further later on. Right? So it being the ism being mabni is due to some resemblance with the harf. Is being mamnu' min as-sarf is due to it having a resemblance with the fi'l. And we'll be looking at the mamnu' min as-sarf in a bit. He expands upon that very usefully in the Mutammima. Okay? So he gives a definition for the ism that is mabni. وهو ما لا يتغير آخره بسبب العوامل الداخلة عليه. It's that whose endings do not change due to the different awamil, agents that enter upon it. What are examples of the ism that is mabni? There's categories of asma that are mabni. So he says كالمضمرات, like the damirs, whether the damir is muttasil or munfasil, right? A connected damir or a disconnected damir. وأسماء الشرط, and the names that are used, they often called أدوات الشرط, the instruments for conditions. وأسماء الاستفهام, right? So man, for example, وما, you say مسمك, right? أين, right? So this is a useful list. Like what asma are? Give me examples of asma that are mabni. Immediately we start thinking names of people, but there's entire categories. Al-mudmarat, asma'u shart, asma'u al-istifham, wa asma' al-ishara. What's an example of asma'u al-ishara? The and the, right? Because when we say هذا, right? Is هذا an ism ishara? The answer is no. The or the is the ism ishara, and the ha is treated separately, right? The ha is harfu tanbih, right? Of course, some modern grammarians don't like this kind of stuff. Just make it simple. Okay, make it simple, but you lose the sophistication of your own language. And a lot of it, and that's part of a civilizational inferiority complex, to be honest, amongst some modernists. Anything that is European is amazing. And the argument is that we've fallen behind. So they're saying we're losers, so we should just become like them. And that's you've confirmed that you're losers. But you're not, right? Because you have a great tradition. First, try to understand it and build upon that. Because when it comes to Arabic grammar arose to properly understand Arabic grammar, right? So anyways, that's a separate discussion, right? So Asma'ul Ishara, like the, هؤلاء, right? و أسماء الأفعال, right? وأسماء الأفعال. Do we have another No, we don't. Asma' al-af'al, these are relatively rare. These are things like صه, right? Right? Or ameen, right? Ameen is an ism fi'l, right? So صه ومه hayhata, these are asma that convey the meaning of a fi'l, and from it is ameen. Ameen is an ism mabni, and what does it indicate? Ameen indicates istajib lana, right? So it's an ism, but it conveys some aspects of the meaning of a fi'l. وأسماء الموصولات, and each of these we'll be encountering them later, right? وأسماء الموصولات, like you say الذي, التي, الذين, اللاتي, right? And each of these has some point of resemblance to a harf, which is why they behave in this way. And then he says, فَمِنْهُ مَا يُبْنَى عَلَى السُّكُونِ. So the asma that are mabni, مِنْهُ مَا يُبْنَى عَلى السُّكُونِ نَحُو كَمْ, right? And the kam can be used for istifham. You ask someone, kam hadha, how much, right? And it can be khabariya. وَمِنْهُ مَا يُبْنَى عَلى الْفَتْحِ. And some asma that are mabni على الفتح, كأين, which is an ism istifham, right? ومنه ما يبنى على الكسر كأمسي, right? Right? Of course, the difference between amsi and amsu with a dhamma. Right? So ams, right, behaves in interesting ways depending. And then how is it mabni? That's something that you should give some thought to, right? Now, ومنه ما يبنى على الضم, and from the asma that are mabniya is that which is mabni على الضم, كحيث, which is a ظرف makan. There's other ways you can use haythu, but don't. Simple as that, right? In classical Arabic, especially in poetry, you could do some other things with haythu, but don't even think of doing it, right? So al-Faqih, he mentions there's 9 different lughat in haythu. Some of these are useful to know just because you may stumble upon some classical poetry, you have no idea what's going on, and if you know these things, you won't be so shocked. وَالْأَصْلُ فِي الْمَبْنِيِّ أَنْ يُبْنَى عَلَى السُّكُونِ. The basis of the mabni is that it's mabni ala sukun. And this is referring to the mabni min al-asma. Right? That the ism, if it's mabni, the default assumption is that it's ala sukun. Right? So this is the discussion on the ism. It's mu'arab and mabni. And the mabni takes these various states. Because if you consider just asma, the names of things, then it's relatively rare for Arab names to be mabni. Right? But foreign names are frequently mabni, particularly certain forms. Right? So, and that goes back to how easily they are Arabized. So, for example, many of the names of flowers are not originally Arab. Some that transfer over easily, they are mu'arab, but they may be mabni min as-sarf because of ujma, of foreignness, right? So like Yasmin, for example, right? It's a foreign name. Many other, and the names of all the prophets, besides 4, are all foreign, but they Arabize, and they're just mamnu' min as-sarf because of ujma. But there are names that don't lend themselves to it because of just the form in the foreign language. So, like names like Sibawayhi, Miskawayhi, Naftawayhi, like that pattern. After that, what are you going to do with Sibawayhi? You can say, Ja'a Sibawayhi hu, Sibawayhi ha, right? So just treated as, and that would be the case with Western names, for example. Ra'aytu, right? Now what's a Paul? Ra'aytu, because I'm sure you've seen the thing about meatball. Like someone translate meatball into Arabic. So they put meat ball, and they translate back into English, say Paul is dead. Because mayyit, so meat, ball, say Paul is dead. Right? But generally, when Western names are Arabized now, people don't say Ja'a Paul, Ja'a Davidu. It's David, right? They'll generally use sukun, right? And that's part of, so the basic point is how things are Arabized goes back to usage. That which is easy to Arabize tended to be mu'arab because that's the asl. But when it would sound strange or be awkward, classically it was common, as in the example cited, that they would make it mabni. Right? So it's not a capitulation. You don't have to say Michaelu. Right? Ra'aytu Michaela. Ra'aytu Michael. Okay? Many of these things the Arabic academies fight over, which is good. وَالْفِعْلُ ضَرْبَانِ. The fi'l also is of two types. مبني وهو الأصل. مبني, fixed in its ending, and that's the asl. And the reason being that the fi'l itself indicates a meaning by its root. And it indicates ما دل على حدث مقترن بزمان. So the hadath, the ma'na of the hadath is indicated by its roots. And the zaman, zaman al-wuqu' is indicated by what? By the sigha. Right? Madi, mudari', amr. So the meanings that are expressed by the fi'l itself as a default are not in need of i'rab, to change. And we'll see why is the exception to that is the mudari'. We'll see why it's different. Right? 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 So he says لأن البناء أصل في الأفعال لأنها لا يعتروها لأنها لا تعتروها معاني مختلفة تفتقر في تمييزها إلى الإعراب. Right? What do you have? Okay. Okay. ومعرب وهو الفرع. And the fi'l can also be mu'rab, and that's secondary. Right? And that's where it resembles the ism in certain ways. Right? And we'll see that when we come to it. والمبني نوعان. المبني من الأفعال نوعان. أحدهما الفعل الماضي. So the مبني من الأفعال is of two types. One is the فعل الماضي وبناؤه على الفتح. Right? The الفعل الماضي مبني على الفتح أبدا. This is what the majority of classical grammarians stuck to. Some of the modern grammarians don't like that. If it says ضربتي, if there's sukun, then خلاص. If there's a sukun, so it's مبني على السكون. But the classical grammarians say it's very being مبني is predicated on it being one state. There, so for example, ضربت, right? Why is there a sukun? Because of a secondary reason. So it says مبني على الفتح وسكن لتوالي الحركات, for example, right? Because of there being too many consecutive harakas. The Arabs did not like 4 consecutive harakas generally. They avoided it when they could, etc. وبناؤه على الفتح. Right? إلا إذا اتصل به واو الجماعة فيضم. Unless connected with واو الجماعة, then it's put in ضمة. نحو ضربوا. Right? أو اتصل به ضمير رفع متحرك فيسكن. نحو ضربت أو ضربنا. Right? right? So here فيضم, right? This is يضم للمناسبة, right? So its bina is on the fath because what is appropriate, for example, in ضربوا, the waw, what is suitable for it is a dhamma before it, right? So the dhamma was given because of munasaba. Right? أو اتصل به ضمير رفع متحرك فيسكن نحو ضربت أو ضربت أو ضربتي وضربنا with a سكون. Right, so here the grammarians themselves in these took two pathways. One is that it is the asl in it is the fatha, and when it moves more rigorously, you say that, for example, that يعني والضمة للمناسبة, right? Like it was put in dhamma because of the munasaba, right? Or for these other reasons, right? And when we see examples of, active examples of i'rab, you'll be seeing this. وَالثَّانِي فِعْلُ الْأَمْرِ. And this is one of the departures of the text in grammatical position from the Ajrumiyya. Because what does the Ajrumiyya mention about the fi'l al-amr? Wal-amru majzumun abadan. Right? The Ajrumiyya itself says that the fi'l is majzumun abadan. The fi'l al-amr is majzumun abadan. It's always in jazm. But we took, when we looked at the Sharh al-Ajrumiyya, that وَالْأَمْرُ يُبْنَى عَلَى مَا يُجْزَمُ بِهِ مُضَارِعُهُ. Right? That's the fi'l al-amr, according to the grammarians, the majority of the grammarians, على الأصح, so he says وفعل الأمر وبناؤه على السكون نحو اضرب واضربنا إلا إذا اتصل به ضمير تثنية أو ضمير جمع أو ضمير المؤنثة المخاطبة فعلى حذف النون. Right? So the فعل أمر is مبني on the سكون if it's صحيح الآخر, إلا إذا اتصل به ضمير تثنية, the dual ضمير, أو ضمير جمع أو ضمير المؤنثة المخاطبة فعلى حذف النون نحو اضربا واضربوا واضربي. Right? So this is the fi'l, the two types of fi'l that are mabni. The madi, and its asl is that it be mabni ala al-fath, unless the fath had to be left due to circumstance. And number two is a fi'l al-amr, which is mabni, though there is a position that it's majzoom But when we come to looking at it further, we'll see. And he says, وَإِلَّا الْمُعْتَلِ. Right? Right? And except for the fi'l amr if it's mu'tal. Right? Which is, what is the fi'l al-mu'tal in general? Is ma akhiruhu harfu illa. That whose last letter is a harf illa, which are waw, alif, or ya. Right? فعلى حذف حرف العلة. In that case, its bina would be in حذف of حرف العلة, just like the فعل المضارع المعتل. Right? نحو اخشى واغزو وارمي. Right? So ikhsha, from khashiya, yakhsha, ikhsha. Right? So ikhsha مبني على حذف الألف, واغزو مبني على حذف الواو, وارمي على حذف الياء. So this is completing the فعل أمر. والمعرب من الأفعال الفعل المضارع. Right? Right? And from the أفعال, only the مضارع is معرب بشرط أن لا يتصل به نون الإناث ولا نون التوكيد المباشرة. On condition that the fi'l mudari' not be connected with nunul inath, yadribna. So it's yadribu, but when the feminine noon comes in, the letter before is put into sukoon, simply because otherwise it would sound strange. Right? Now, why did they put a noon for, when to indicate the feminine? That's how the Arabs spoke. Right? So he says, نحو يضرب ويخشى. Okay? The examples of that are يضرب and يخشى. Right? So يضرب is an example of the فعل المضارع being معرب لفظا, and يخشى فعل مضارع مرفوع بضمة مقدرة في آخره منع من ظهورها التعذر. Right? Right? So it's مرفوع بضمة مقدرة. فإن اتصلت به نون الإناث بني على السكون. Right? And this is the sounder way of making i'rab of it. There are other opinions regarding this. Right? And Al-Fakihi gives an example, so let's just look at it from Surah Al-Baqarah. وَالْوَالِدَاتُ يُرْضِعْنَا. Right? So he says, فَالْوَالِدَاتُ مُبْتَدَأٌ وَيُرْضِعْنَا فعل مضارع مبني على السكون لاتصاله بالنون, because of the noon النسوة entering upon it. Right? And then he goes into an i'rab of the rest of the sentence. We don't need to get into that. The shahid is يرضعن is فعل مضارع مبني على السكون لاتصاله بنون النسوة. Right? وإن اتصلت به نون التوكيد المباشرة بني على الفتح. And if it connected with in a direct noon of توكيد, it's مبني on the فتح. ثقيلة كانت أو خفيفة, whether the noon of توكيد is heavy or light. The examples mentioned in the Ajrumiyya, the Mutammima itself, نحو لا يسجنن ولا يكونن. Right? So the first, and this is frequently mentioned because the first of them is نون التوكيد ثقيلة, and the second is خفيفة. Right? And they're mentioned next to each other, so they like this example a lot, right? And right. So this is from the Zawaid of the Mutammima. The Mutammima added this issue of the Mabni to the opening of Babul I'rab, right? By making Babul I'rab wal Bina. And some of the footnotes in our copy are like way out there, insofar as, he's quoting like from all over the place, and it's not entirely necessary. And one of the useful things in the Kawakib al-Durriya is that any of the verses that are mentioned, right, he does full i'rab of them in the Kawakib al-Durriya. So the first example, وَالْوَالِدَاتُ يُرْضِعْنَ, right, he gives the i'rab, which is very useful. And we'd mentioned that whenever a verse is mentioned, a verse of Quran is mentioned in the Mutammima itself, please write out the i'rab yourself. And you can refer to the Kawakib al-Durriya because it does the i'rab for you. It is also quite useful to have a copy. There's some copies of the Mus'haf that that have i'rab al-Quran and it's mukhtasar, and that's quite useful. Right? In one volume, there's a couple of tafasir that have i'rab al-Quran al-Kareem. One is by a Darwish from Damascus. You can find from Syria, I'm not sure, and that you can find online, like the PDF. Can be useful, but it can be a bit overkill at this stage. But the Kawakib al-Durriya mentions it. So وَالْوَالِدَاتُ يُرْضِعْنَ, he says إعرابه الواو حرف عطف الوالدات مبتدأ مرفوع بالابتداء وعلامة رفعه ضم آخره ويرضعن فعل مضارع مبني على السكون لاتصاله بنون النسوة ونون النسوة ضمير متصل في محل رفع فاعل وجملة الفعل والفاعل في محل رفع خبر المبتدأ. So he does full i'rab of al-walidatu yurdi'na, and this is good practice, right? La yusjananna, right? He does i'rab of that as well. You can, please do write out the i'rab. Some of them can be a little more tricky, right? The point here is the mahal shahid is the fact that the nun tawqid enters upon it, whether the nun tawqid is thaqil or khafif. In either case, what does it do? It puts the fi'l mudari' into a state of bina على ماذا؟ على الفتح. It's right there in the text, guys. Right? So then, of course, the question arises: if the asl, there's a principle, a rational principle in general, كل ما ثبت على خلاف الأصل فلا بد له من دليل. Anything that's established contrary to the asl, there should be a reason. Right? So let's say, Sidi Zain comes wearing a thobe. He wears a thobe normally. So if that's the asl, it doesn't require an explanation. But one day, see, Hamza shows up in cowboy pants and one of those cowboy hats. That's khilaful asl. So we have a right to ask why. Right? كل ما ثبت على خلاف الأصل فلا بد له من دليل. So he explains this in the matan, and this can be criticized because المتون بناء المتون على جمع المسائل. The basis of a matan is to gather the issues, not to give the reasoning. But because the purpose here is fa'idah, he does do it. So he says, وَإِنَّمَا أُعْرِبَ الْمُضَارِعُ لِمُشَابَهَتِهِ لِلْإِسْمِ. The mudari' was made mu'rab because it has a mushabaha to the ism. How? Because the fi'l al-mudari' in the forms it takes is where it is in the sentence brings out different meanings. Why? Because there are the things that enter into the mudari', right? Which are the nawasib and the jawazim. Right? أريد أن أجلس. لم أجلس. Right? The nawasib and the jawazim, which change the meaning. Right? Which change the meaning in the ways that we'll be seeing. Right? The nawasib do certain things to the mudari'. The jawazim do other things to the mudari'. So how can we tell these various distinct functions of the mudari'? By making it mu'rab, as opposed to the fi'l madi, because it's already happened. No affecting agents enter upon the fi'l itself, so of the fi'l madi itself, so it intrinsically remains in one state. So therefore, it was suitable to consider it, to make it mabni, but the mudari', given the various states that affect it, right? Of which practically are those things that we refer to as being the nawasib and the jawazim, and they affect. لن أذهب. يعني أذهب, لن أذهب projects the meaning of the مضارع into the future. لم أذهب throws it back into the past. أن أذهب, أريد أن أذهب. Right? It affects the meaning as well, because it gives them, it brings the aspect of مصدرية, because أريد أن أذهب, أن وما بعدها, أن أذهب is like saying أريد الذهاب. Right? Because أن is حرف, that's we call it حرف what? Nasb, but there's something more to it. We took this in the awamil, guys. You guys are like, what? Allahu Akbar. حرف 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 مصدري, حرف مصدري ونصب. حرف مصدري ونصب. Right? It, the an and what is after is like a masdar, the verbal noun. It indicates the action itself. Right? Like in English, to go. Right? So it indicates the meaning of the verb, and its time is not the primary focus. Right? And we'll so because of that, that things enter upon it, changing its meaning, and those meanings then need to require a differentiator. The differentiator of meanings is i'rab. How do you distinguish between a default fi'l mudari' رفع, a fi'l mudari' affected by a set of instruments that behave in a certain way, which which we refer to as the nawasib, or the jawazim, or those instruments we refer to as jawazim, which have shared characteristics. These various states, just use the Arab for them, right? So the Arabs spoke in remarkably consistent ways to convey a remarkably nuanced set of meanings. Then he says the huruf don't get much attention in Nahu, right? In of themselves, but the huruf have their own marvel, as we will see. So he says, أما الحروف فمبنية كلها. As for the huruf, they're all in bina. Right? And regardless of the type of the length of the huruf can be, you can have a singular harf like the ba, or 2-letter harf, or 3-letter harf, or 4-letter harf. There's even 5-letter huruf. Right? But there's no huruf that are longer than 5 letters. And they're of different types. The huruf, they're mabni on any of the various states, and the examples are given. By al-Fakihi. Then he says, باب معرفة علامات الإعراب. Any questions before we continue? So here, the معرفة علامات الإعراب, this is, much of it is similar to what we've taken the Ajrumiyya, but there are subtle additions. So keep on top of them. As we'd mentioned, it's good to keep a copy of the Ajrumiyya next to you to see what are the additions. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, باب معرفة علامات الإعراب. للرفع أربع علامات. Rafa has 4 signs. Right? These يجمعها قولك ضوان ضم واو ألف نون. Right? للرفع أربع علامات الضمة وهي الأصل. So the أصل is the ضمة. والواو والألف والنون وهي نائبة عن الضمة. Right? And the other three signs are فروع. Right? And each has reasons why they're used, practically because the dhamma would either not be possible or be inconvenient. Right? فأما الضمة فتكون علامة للرفع في أربعة مواضع. As for the dhamma, it's a sign of رفع in 4 places. What are they? في الاسم المفرد. Right? In the ism mufrad, and the ism mufrad is hard to pin down a definition of it, the singular. So they just said the singular is ما ليس مثنى ولا مجموعا ولا من الأسماء الستة. Right? And logicians don't like these kinds of definitions. What is A? A is that which is not B, C, or D. Usually, if you find that kind of definition, it's a good hint, typically, that this is something notoriously difficult, or that this may be something difficult to define. Sometimes it's just very difficult to get a definition that fits. And sometimes the definition would be very complicated, given the level at which we want to explain something. And sometimes, because even if we could technically define it in a sophisticated way, the purpose of a definition is clarity. And by defining something in a very awkward way, what have you done? You've missed. That's why the definition it can be called a had, and it's called had because it نضع حدود المعنى. We delimit the meaning. يعني يجمع ما يدخل فيها ويخرج ما سواه, allowing to enter that which is part of the meaning and excluding everything else. But the definition is also called ta'rif, because it's that which makes something known. So من مستحسنات التعريف أن يكون واضحا, that it be clear. Of course, the clarity given the relative level at which we're talking. So if you looked around, you would find, examples of these. So في الاسم المفرد منصرفا كان أو غير منصرف. Right? Is this in the أجرمية? منصرفا كان أو غير منصرف? Nope. Right? So there's a few extra points here, right? Right? So he tells us first, there's a few additions. Right? And we've been encouraged to write out the matan. Doesn't hurt to underline what are the additions from the Ajrumiyya. Everyone writing out the matan? Allahumma ighfir lil muslimin wal muslimat ya Rabb. Okay. So inshallah you guys can round him up and give him some nasiha. It's very important. Right? الذي علم بالقلم. It's very important. So he says whether the ism is munsarif or not. Because they're two separate things. Al-mana' min al-sarf, right? That which does not take a kasra, right? Has some similitude in a sense with the bina, but they're two separate things. They're two separate things. So the munsarif is that which takes tanween. And the غير munsarif is that which does not take tanween. Right? Because as-sarf huwa at-tanween. And the tanween indicates the default usage of the tanween. We took the tanween is 4 types. The basic tanween is called tanweenul. What's the basic tanween? Say it confidently. No. There's 4 types of tanween. The basic tanween is تنوين التمكين وهو ما يدل على تمكن الاسم right يعني في الإعراب right أو تمكن الاسم في الاسمية right that it is a full-blooded ism. It doesn't have any resemblance to the fi'l. So there's no elements of non-ismness affecting it, basically. That's تنوين التمكين. ما يدل على تمكنه في باب الاسمية. And غير منصرف, which has some elements of non-ismness, generally, there being resemblances to fi'l. So he says, نحو قال الله تعالى. What? أعوذ بالله. Okay. Is قال الله one of the examples in your matan? Okay. So قال الله is not, because technically قال الله is there in Surah Al Imran. Right? So is that right? So Surah Al Imran verse 55, it references it, but the more likely is that he's not referring to it in that way. Right? نحو قال الله تعالى. Right? Though it would appear that this is, so there's 3 examples here. نحو قال الله تعالى, that's one example. Sorry, نحو قال الله. Right? وإذ قال إبراهيم, example 2. وإذ قال موسى, example number 3. Because both al-Fakihi and al-Ahdal do i'rab of قال الله. نحو قال الله. You know, al-Ahdal in al-Kawakib says هذا مثال للمنصرف. Right? Right? So قال الله, يعني, this is an example of الاسم المفرد المنصرف. المفعول مرفوع على الفاعلية علامة رفعه الضمة، يعني الضمة في آخره. المثال الثاني وإذ قال إبراهيم. Right? فإبراهيم is غير منصرف. Right? So this is an ism مفرد غير منصرف. Right? Why? Because it has 2 of the illas of منع من الصرف, which is al-Alamiyya wal-Ujma. It's a foreign name. Right? للعلمية, it's an ism alam, and Ujma, it's foreign. Right? And the i'rab is done there. The third example, الثالث, وَإِذْ قَالَ مُوسَى. Musa is what? What kind of example is this? Right? This is اسم مفرد. It's غير منصرف, but he uses it here as an example of إعراب تقديري. Because إذ قال موسى, Musa is فاعل مرفوع بضمة مقدرة في آخره منع من ظهورها التعذر, because of the alif, right? Because الألف لا تقبل الحركة لذاتها. So there's three examples here. You do well to make i'rab of these, right? You do very well to make i'rab of these, and to the extent that you do, you'll benefit, right? And you can use the kawakib, and we'd suggested doing, keeping a notebook separately for your notes and keep the i'rab separate, right? Because you may need to do some doodling, etc. there. How you take your notes, that's up to you, right? So that's الموضع الأول. الموضع الثاني في جمع التكسير منصرفا كان أو غير منصرف, right? جمع التكسير فالضمة تكون علامة للرفع في 4 مواضع. في الاسم المفرد المنصرف, and he gave some details about it, right? An example, so these are the zawaid, the extras from the Mutammima. Second is جمع التكسير, right? And he gives a good definition here of جمع التكسير. هو ما تغير فيه بناء مفرده, right? تحقيقا كان أو تقديرا بزيادة أو نقص أو تبديل, right? Because the جمع التكسير can be with زيادة or نقص or تبديل. Things can change. منصرفا, and we looked at this in the تحفة السنية. Shaykh Muhyiddin Abdul Hamid had a good discussion on this. Don't lose those فوائد. منصرفا كان أو غير منصرف. نحو قال أصحاب موسى, right? قال أصحاب موسى, right? So قال فعل ماضي, أصحاب is, what is أصحاب? Right. It's the فاعل. It's as a word it's جمع تكسير. It's فاعل مرفوع بضمة ظاهرة في آخره, right? That's the شاهد. وهو مضاف, and موسى مضاف إليه في محل جر, right? بكسرة مقدرة في آخره منع من ظهورها التعذر. You can't say موسى, right? It is موسى, right? And you can see the i'rab in the kawakib. So that's example number 1. Example number 2 is وَمَسَاكِنَ تَرْضَوْنَهَا. Okay, so what's the shahid there? Yeah, because the shahid, contrary to our copy, is that it's marfu', right? Okay, if before the end of the class today there's another mistake, I'm going to put my copy of the book close to recycling. Like, this is scandalous, right? So مساكن ومساكن ترضونها, right? Right? So of course ومساكن ترضونها is معطوف, right? Right? الواو is عطف المعطوف على قوله تعالى آباؤكم إن كان آباؤكم, right? وأبناؤكم, right? So you can see the i'rab of there, right? And this is from Surah At-Tawbah, right? So the shahid is masakin. Masakin is what? Jam'a taksir. Maskan, plural, masakin. The shahid is simply that it's yurfa' bil-dhamm. That's it. The i'rab is useful to do, right? And also, there's many benefits to doing i'rab, right? Because if you go back to the verse, over a couple of months, we'll be going through 150 verses. So it is a good chance to check the context of the verse. Just quickly, what does the full verse say? Right? So there are many benefits to it, and those benefits accumulate. وَمَسَاكِنُ تَرْضَوْنَهَا. The third example he gives is وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ الْجَوَارِ, right? وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ الْجَوَارِ, right? And it's marfu', right? على الابتداء, right? Because it's مبتدأ. الجواري is مبتدأ. So الجواري is plural of جارية بمعنى ما يجري, right? الجواري, because it's like قاضي, right? It's because of ثقل, because it's an اسم منقوص. فعلامة رفعه ضمة مقدرة في الياء منع من ظهورها الاستثقال, right? 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 So the i'rab in this can be again ظاهر أو مقدر. The third case الموضع الثالث في جمع المؤنث السالم, right? Right? جمع المؤنث السالم, and الفاكي he gives a nice definition, وهو ما سلم فيه بناء مفرده, right? But they prefer to saying ما جمع بألف وتاء, that which is in jama' because of alif and ta, because of it's not always salim, right? وما حمل عليه, this is again from his additions, right? Right? Which is like the jama' al-mu'annath salim, which is the ism al-jama', right? So the example of jama' al-mu'annath is إذا جاءك المؤمنات, right? So mu'minat is, what kind of word is mu'minat? Jama' mu'annath salim, using the Ajrumiyya expression. The shahid is, there's a dhamma there. إذا جاءك, again, if you do the i'rab, you'll get to see what is إذا, what is the kaf, etc. So you'll pick up a lot of Arabic tools if you do it. So please help us out. And the second example, which is ما حمل على جمع المؤنث السالم, he gives the example again from the Quran. I always get nervous reading this because a good friend of mine with Shaykh Abdurrahman Qarsa, he got really nervous because we were reading from an old copy. He says, وَأُولَاتُ الْأَجْمَالِ. And Shaykh Abdurrahman Qarsa broke down because وَأُولَاتُ الْأَحْمَالِ, those who, are carrying a child. Haml, pregnancy. Ahmal, because it's plural. Ulat, those who are in a state of pregnancy. They're carrying a child. But Ajmal, plural of Jamal, those who have camels, those women who have camels, right? But Ulatul Ahmali, right? So this word Ulat is ismu jam'in. لا واحد له من لفظه. Right? So this is a shahid. So this is again from the zawaid of the Mutammima that he added to the Jam' Mu'annath Salim. He added to it وَمَا حُمِلَ عَلَيْهِ, which has a couple of things amongst them. Here, the ism jama'. And the fourth case of the رفع being with ضم is والموضع الرابع في الفعل المضارع وفي الفعل المضارع الذي لم يتصل بآخره شيء. Right? يعني لم يتصل بآخره شيء مما يوجب بناءه أو ينقل إعرابه. Right? So he gives examples. Again, that's from the Zawaid. نحو نرفع درجات من نشاء. Right? Where's the shahid here? Why does he mention this? نرفع. نرفع is a فعل مضارع لم يتصل بآخره شيء فهو مرفوع بالضم. Simple. That's the shahid. But the i'rab نرفع, you see how you make i'rab of the ضمير. نرفع. Right? What's the fa'il? نحن. Right? And darajatin, how you make i'rab of that? Man nasha'u, etc. So you can see the i'rab of that in the least. Like if someone's feeling really lazy, just read the i'rab from the Kawakib. You can actually write the i'rab. If you can do the i'rab yourself, that's much better. And just use the Kawakib as a cheat sheet. Right? And there's many benefits in doing so. Okay. The second case is والله يدعو إلى دار السلام. Yes, right. والله يدعو إلى دار السلام. What's the example here? يدعو. So يدعو is what? فعل مضارع مرفوع بضمة. Where's the ضمة? Where's the ضمة? بضمة مقدرة في آخره. Why didn't we mention it? منع من ظهورها الثقل. Because you could say يدعو. Can you say it? But it would sound strange. يدعو. Right? It's possible. It's not muta'adhir. This is thiqal, right? And he explains that. Sometimes they call it thiqal, sometimes they call it al-istithqal, right? Same meaning, essentially. والله يدعو فاعله ضمير مستتر فيه جوازا إلى دار السلام جار ومجرور ومضاف إليه متعلق بالفعل, right? And then he gives Dar al-Salam is one of the names for Jannah. Now, of course, the ulama differed. Are these different places in Jannah? And likewise, the names of hell, are these different places? Or these are all awsaf of Jannah and Jahannam in themselves? That's a matter of ikhtilaf. Right? And then والله يدعو إلى دار السلام. And he says وأما الواو. So we have ضمة, واو, ألف, and نون. Right? These are the علامات of the رفع. وأما الواو فتكون علامة للرفع في موضعين. As for the واو, it's a sign of رفع in two cases. في جمع المذكر السالم, right, in the sound male plural. وما حمل عليه, and that which is considered like the جمع المذكر السالم. So he says نحو ويومئذ يفرح المؤمنون, and on that day the believers will rejoice, from Surah Ar-Rum. Right? What's the shahid? What's the shahid here? Al-Mu'minun. Al-Mu'minun here is, what is this grammatical state? What? Al-Mu'minun is? Yeah, it's fa'il marfu' بماذا؟ بالواو. That's it. Right? But again, يومئذ, right? The i'rab is useful because you'll see the يومئذ, right? This is a type of, what type of tanween is this? Yeah, this is tanween al-iwad, right? إن يفرح فعل مضارع مرفوع بالضم, المؤمنون فاعل مرفوع بالواو نيابة عن الضمة لأنه جمع مذكر سالم. And وما حمل عليه, this is an addition. Why? And he gives an example. إن يكن منكم 20 صابرون. Right? إن يكن منكم 20 صابرون. It's محمول على جمع المذكر السالم because the 20, is it جمع of عشر? No. You don't have عشر and عشراني and عشرون. Right? No. Right? It simply behaves like جمع المذكر السالم. Right? So that's ما حمل عليه. Right? Right? And again, 20 لا واحد له من لفظه. And likewise, the other numbers, يعني from 20 to 90, all of them behave in this way. It's وف وفي الأسماء الستة, and for the أسماء الستة, right? And these أسماء الستة, right? They have 4 shurut, which we'll be seeing in a bit. But he basically summarizes. He says these are المعتلة المضافة لغير ياء المتكلم. Right? So they're mu'tal, they each end with a harf illa, and they're mudaf, and they're mudaf to غير ياء المتكلم. The other condition is that they're mukabbar, not musaghar. So there's 4 conditions for the asma' as-sitta to behave in the way that they do. Right? They're al-mu'talla al-mudafa al-mu'talla al-mukabbara. You can add the mukabbara, right? Al-mudafa li ghayri ya al-mutakallim. Al-mudafa li ghayri ya al-mutakallim. So there's 4 conditions. وهي أبوك. For some didn't like that expression, but that's a bit takalluf, right? Like when it says like, because وأخوك وحموك. Right? It's better to say hamuki. Right? Right? As al-Faki he points out, because the asl of the ham is their aqarib of the zawj. But yutawassa' fihi. Right? Although al-Ahdal says, right? So if you see it, al-Ahdal, he argues, and there's ikhtilaf on this, like most things, that it hamuki بكسر القاف بكسر الكاف لا غير. right? بكسر الكاف لا غير لأن for the لأن الحم, the ham refers to the close relatives of the husband, right? Right? أما الختن فهو قريب المرأة, right? But it's in many cultures, and the Arabs vary on usage of things like this, but this is a urf tari', it's a later urf. Right. وفي الأسماء الستة وهي أبوك وأخوك وحموك وحموك وفوك وهنوك وذو مال. Right? So what's the addition here? Right? He added وهنوك, right? And الهن, they say اسم يكن به عما يستقبح التصريح بذكره كالفرج. So the hen is used to allude to that which is considered reprehensible to mention explicitly, like someone's private parts, for example. Right? Right? So you can quote that from the Kawakib if you want. الهن اسم يكن به عما يستقبح ذكره كالفرج. Right? It's like someone's private parts. And very often, they'd use it in insulting ways. Right? وَذُو مَالٍ. And of course, the mal is just mentioned as an accompaniment, right? So he gives examples, right? What's the first example? نحو قال أبوهم, right, from Surah Yusuf. ليوسف وأخوه أحب إلى أبينا. Right? What's the example here? أخوه. Right? وجاء حموك. Right? So حم. وهذا فوك وهنوك. Although that normally you wouldn't say something like that in polite company. Right? So again, there's a couple of examples. For those interested, just so we don't miss it, in the Kawakib, at the first quote, when it says قال الله, as an example, he mentions that the author of the Mutammima frequently, the default examples he uses are from the Quran. And it says لعله تبركا بالآيات القرآنية. Right? And he quotes Imam al-Suyuti that كل ما قرئ به جاز الاحتجاج به في العربية. That anything that has been recited of the Quran, meaning any of the 10 canonical recitations, is a hujjah in the Arabic language. Right? And it's all fasih. Right? Of course, it's one of the silly things, and it's a number of the contemporary works in Ulum al-Quran dismiss that argument. One of the things the Orientalists like saying, look, there's grammatical errors in the Quran. And that's something that even someone who thinks a little bit would realize how imbecile that argument is, because the rules of the Arabic language emerged to explain the usage of the Arabs. The usage of the Arabs precedes the rules of the Arabic language. Right? The rules are an attempt to encompass how the Arabs spoke. But also, the rules of Arabic are nuanced because, and that's beyond the scope of the Mutammima, but the Arabs spoke, there's different tribes that spoke in different ways. Right? And those different modes of those different usages are contained within the 10 qira'at. Right? So that's not a very smart attack on the Quran. And the works of Ulum al-Quran discuss that well. وقال, okay, then what do you have? وَإِنَّهُ لَذُو عِلْمٍ, and indeed he's a person of knowledge. Again from Surah Yusuf. So inna is harf of tawqeed and nasb, right? And you can see the i'rab there. أما الألف فتكون علامة للرفع في المثنى. Right? And Imam Faqih, he gives a good definition of the muthanna. Al-Faqih paid a lot of attention to definitions. He actually has a very useful little treatise called رسالة الحدود, or sometimes published as الحدود النحوية by al-Fakihi. There's a few commentaries on it. المثنى وما حمل عليه, and that which is like the مثنى, نحو قال رجلان from Surah Al-Ma'idah. Right? رجلان يعني is فاعل مرفوع وعلامة رفعه ماذا؟ الألف. That's and إن عدة الشهور عند الله 12 شهرا. What is the shahid? Is what's the shahid, guys? Yeah, right. So 12, right, is this ithna, right, is not the dual of ithn. So you say ithnani, yani, right? But ithnan, also it's tricky because it is refers to two. But is ithnan muthanna? No. Because if you look at the definition given by al-Fakihi, the dual is one word that relieves you of the need of of using a'atf. You can't say ithn wa ithn equals ithnan. They say rajul wa rajul equals rajulan. Right? That's why this is mahmulun ala al-muthanna. But it's not muthanna in itself. Okay. وأما النون فتكون علامة للرفع في الفعل المضارع إذا اتصل به ضمير تثنية. Did he use two examples or one? Yeah. He used two examples, right? فانفجرت منه 12 عينا. So he used two examples for this. Okay? From Surah Al-Baqarah. Okay? Again, the shahid being 12. Right? This is 12 is مرفوع بالألف لأنه محمول على المثنى. Right? وأما النون فتكون علامة للرفع في الفعل المضارع إذا اتصل به ضمير تثنية. نحو أينما تقومان. ونحو والنجم والشجر يسجدان. Right? This is the ضمير of فعل مضارع إذا اتصل به ضمير تثنية. Right? والنجم والشجر يسجدان. So يسجدان is فعل مضارع مرفوع بالألف لأنه ماذا؟ Is it? Are you guys awake? What's يسجدان is what? مرفوع بماذا؟ بماذا؟ We just read وأما النون فتكون علامة للرفع. Right? So people get confused with this all the time and they're mentioned next to each other. The muthanna is an ism. Right? And it's مرفوع بماذا؟ with the alif. The فعل المضارع إذا اتصل به يعني ماذا؟ ضمير تثنية أو ضمير جمع أو ضمير جمع المذكر أو ضمير المؤنثة, then its رفع is with what? Is with what? Is with noon, right? So this sometimes is good to make like a micro chart, a quick chart that, you know, two things that look similar. The al-ism al-muthanna, its rafa is with what? With the alif. The fi'l al-mudari' al-muthanna, its rafa is bin noon. Right? Correct? Yes, because you have textual evidence in front of you. Right? Okay. وَالنَّجْمُ وَالشَّجَرُ يَسْجُدَانِ أو ضمير جمع المذكر. Right? And what's the example given? والذين, no, they, أو ضمير المذكر. Okay. So there is here again اضطراب in the copy, right? الذين يؤمنون بالغيب. So what's the shahid? يؤمنون is فعل مضارع مرفوع وعلامة رفعه ثبوت النون. Right? Right? أو ضمير المؤنثة المخاطبة, or the ضمير of the female who is addressed. قالوا أتعجبين من أمر الله. So أتعجبين من أمر الله. تعجبين is the noon here is ضمير of the مؤنثة المخاطبة, and its presence is an indicator of it being in rafa. So those are the alamat of rafa, and then we have, after that we have وَلِلنَّصْبِ خَمْسُ عَلَامات. So we'll stop there at the nasb. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us understanding and clarity. And he quotes, you know, sometimes some editors get more caught up by giving points of benefit than actually putting a lot of focus on the text itself. There's a nice poem. You should take a picture of the poem because it's quite nice. We'll refer to it, right? Because there's some things that you don't say, like, you know, there's adab with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you don't say, for example, maf'ul bihi, you would say, you'd put it, you know, there's different ways of saying it, right? So they'd say, for example, mansubun ala ta'zim, right? Ittaqullaha. Ittaqu antum Allah. But you wouldn't say it's maf'ul bihi, right? For lafz al-jalalah, they would say mansubun ala ta'zim. right? So there's expressions to use, and the editor here, Hafidhahullah Ta'ala, gives a nice poem. Be good to try to work through the poem yourselves. There's points of benefit in it. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. Go ahead.